Hi everyone, welcome back to Feather Stitch House. My name's Rebecca and each week on this channel I upload videos about embroidery and textile art to help you get creative. Today we have got the next episode in our Feather Stitch House A to Z series, and this is where we explore stitches beginning with each letter of the alphabet. I'll explain more about what inspired this process in a moment, but hopefully there will be something new here for everyone. This family of stitches is one of my favourites. In it is Feather Stitch, which gave this channel and our business its name, so I hope you love that stitch as much as I do. There are a couple of new ones here to me, so some that didn't appear on the original page in my stitch journal, and they are an absolute treat, so do stay tuned and look out for those. I know that some of these stitches might be familiar to you, so I will put some chapter markers in so that you can skip to the stitches that are new to you if you want to. You don't have to sit through things that you already know, so I hope that makes things a little bit easier for you. I'm going to explain in a moment all the equipment that I'm using, so gather all your bits and pieces and let's get stitching.
So this is the project that inspired this series of videos. This is my Stitch alphabet book and it is only partly finished because I started it probably about 3 years ago now and stalled partway through, and I wanted to get back into it, thought what's going to motivate me, and so I decided to kind of remake the Stitch tutorial videos for YouTube and kickstart it. So we've already done the A page. All the pages are made in a similar way. So this is a 6x6 book. I appliqued on a felt letter and then filled the page with stitches beginning with that letter. So that's my A page. We did our B page. There's lots of knots on this. Really enjoyed stitching this with lots of different B stitches. So there's braid stitch, bullion knots, that sort of stuff. This was our C page, and I themed this around circles because that also begins with C. And then here's our D page, and if you are wondering what made me choose these colours, they were chosen for me by my Instagram followers at the time. So I put a poll on giving them a set of choices and they selected which one they liked the most. So that's why the colours are chosen as they are. So D was lots of detached and double stitches, so this was quite a fun one as well. I never stitch in orange, but I really liked the way this one turned out, and some of my favourites on here as well. And then last time we looked at E stitches, and there aren't very many stitches beginning with E, so I created a background using English paper piecing as well, just to add to the E features. So today we're working on stitches beginning with F, and this was my F page. I absolutely love this page and it was so popular when I posted it on Instagram. I used a bit of fabric with fishes on it as inspiration. Again, it was chosen for me, and so I've got this lovely kind of mustard and grey scheme with a bit of tweed on there as well. So these are some of my favourite stitches, and I have learnt some more since I made this, and I'm not going to remake the page. I'm going to stick with what I've got. It's a sign of learning. So these are the stitches we're going to look at today. There's 8 of them, and some of them will be quite familiar and others will be completely new. So there's a couple of new ones that are new to me. Hopefully there will be something here that is fresh, and these all are really useful in slow stitch in particular. So I'm using a Nurge hoop, size 3, it's a 6-inch hoop. I've put some natural linen in it, and you are probably better off using something like a linen or a cotton for this, something that has got a relatively open weave that is going to be easy to get your needle through. Felt would also be good for learning stitches. You don't want anything too tight because we want this to be easy as we're learning. The thread I'm using is a Sheepy's Maxi Sweet Treat. Now, I do think these have been rebranded. I buy these from Wool Warehouse in the UK, and they are now called Sugar Rush. So I think whether you buy Maxi Sweet Treat or Sugar Rush, Sheepy's is the brand. It's essentially the same, and this is a twisted thread rather than a stranded thread, so that means that the thread will hold together, and I do find twisted threads much easier for learning stitches with, because I haven't got to work out how to manage the individual strands of thread. It will just all hold together and I can concentrate on forming the stitch. So I'm using shade 249, which is Saffron. It's a good chunky thread, really easy to use. And I'm using a size 4 embroidery needle. Now, just a note on needles, if you can thread it and it makes a hole big enough to make the thread easy to pull through your fabric, then that's basically my only criteria for needles. I know that some people are really specific about the size or type of needle that you use. I am not one of those people. I think if it's comfortable to hold and your thread doesn't keep falling out of it, it's fine. So I prefer a chunkier needle. I do have some loss of sensation in my fingertips, and so I like a chunky, lengthy needle that I can feel in my hand as I'm sewing. I tend to find that if my needle's too fine or small, I keep dropping it all the time. But I am not a needle purist. I'm not a trained embroiderer. This is just trial and error through my life, and I think just use what you've got. Don't get hung up on rules. If you feel comfortable stitching with it and it works, that's fine. Probably the only criteria is that the needle makes a hole big enough for the thread to pass through. So other than that, that's it. I'm going to support my hoop in a Elbacy versatile table clamp, which means I can use both hands while I'm filming, and that's about it. So you can pull together some bits and pieces to get stitching and learn along with me if you want to. If you are finding this video helpful and you think other people would value it, then please don't forget to hit that like button, and you can share the video using the forward arrow if you want to. Yeah, that's great. Let's get stitching. I'm going to start by drawing a vertical line on my fabric. I'm just using a heat erase pen here, and this is going to be my guideline for our first stitch. So the first one we're going to look at is Fern Stitch, and this is worked top to bottom down a vertical line, so this is a nice easy one to start with. So I'm going to start at the top of my line. I've come a little way down there, just about a centimetre down from the top, and I want to go a little way up and out to the right to create a diagonal stitch. Now I want to hop across back onto my centre line, lined up kind of with the top of that diagonal stitch. You can go a little bit higher if you want to. This is just the starting point of this stitch, and pull my needle through, and I'm going to take it back down at the bottom of that diagonal stitch, so our starting point where we first brought the needle through the fabric, pulling through again. Now I want to make another diagonal stitch out to the left this time, so I want to go directly across from the top of that first diagonal out to the left, pull through, and then I'm going to go back down at our starting point again for a third time. So when we're starting this stitch off, we want to make these 3 straight stitches that all meet together at a point at the bottom of the stitch. So now I'm going to come down my line about a centimetre. I'm making these stitches quite large so that you can see. So for me it's about a centimetre, and I'm going back down at that starting point again, so that's the 4th stitch that's going into that point. Now I want to come out to the right, directly underneath the end of that first diagonal, and kind of lined up with that starting point where all those stitches meet, and I'm going to put in my new diagonal down to the bottom of that straight stitch. Then I hop across to the left underneath the top of that left hand diagonal, and I'm going to come down to the bottom of that straight stitch. So now we've got our 3 stitches meeting at that point at the bottom of the stitch again. Now we're going to add our 4th stitch in. We're going to come down the line about a centimetre again and go back through that meeting point, and that's the start of our new stitch. So out to the right, making a diagonal stitch down to the bottom of that first straight stitch, up on the left and diagonally down to that meeting point again, and then we're going to put our straight stitch in that starts our new fern stitch. So about a centimetre down the line and back up to the meeting point. And we are just going to carry on in the same way, and there's no reason why you couldn't make this in a sort of curve. So you could draw in a curvy line, you don't have to stitch it dead straight. So out to the right and down on the line, out to the left and down on the line, then down the line and back up to the meeting point, and we just carry on in that way. So here's my line of fern stitch all put in place. Now we're going to make a new stitch. This one's called fly stitch, and it's going to look very similar, but it's stitched in a different way. So I've got 3 vertical lines. I'm coming up on my left hand line and I'm going to hop straight across to the right hand line, and I want my needle to go down horizontally across from where I brought it up, and that is going to create a sort of U-shaped loop on the surface of my fabric. So now I want to find my centre line, and I want to come down a little way from the top of the line. So again, I'm going to work on roughly a centimetre. I want to bring my needle up inside that loop. Now when I pull through, that loop is going to gather in and it's going to get caught on the working thread, and it's going to pull that loop into a V shape, and that's the start of our stitch. Now we're going to put a little stalk on, so we're going to come down our line about a centimetre and pull through, and that's essentially our detached fly stitch that we learnt back when we were doing D stitches. What we're going to look at today though is how to make a continuous chain of these. So that's our first stitch. We're going to go straight into making our next stitch. So we want to find the bottom of that V and bring our needle back up horizontally across on the left hand line and pull through. Then we're going to hop straight across horizontally to the right hand line and go back down at the equivalent point. There's our U-shaped loop again, and I'm going to come up on the centre line right at the bottom of that vertical stitch that we put in, pull through, and that's our next V. And again we're going to come down our centre line and make a straight stitch, and that's our next fly stitch, and we carry on in that way. So up on the left, lined up with the bottom of that V, hop across to the right and go down and pull into a loop, and then we come up at the bottom of the previous stalk and pull through, and then go back down about a centimetre down, and we just carry on making stitches like that until our line is complete. And again, you can curve these, so if your lines are curved, your fly stitches will follow that curve, and they actually look really nice stitched in curves. So it's one that you can really play around with. If you run out of thread, it really isn't the end of the world. So I'm going to start a new thread because I've almost run out. You want to finish off on a stalk. So at the bottom of a stalk, you can take your needle off, finish off your thread on the back, and then you're going to bring in a new thread and carry on essentially as though nothing's happened. And I'm going to show you that you won't be able to tell where the thread ended. So we're just going to start on the left hand side again. It's a new piece of thread, hop across to the right, make our loop, and then we're going to come up at the bottom of that stalk where we finished our thread, pull through, and you can no longer tell that we're working with a new piece of thread. The key is to finish on a vertical stalk rather than on the V, and that way you can bring in a new piece of thread if you need to. So that's my line of fly stitch. You can, if you want to, finish your line with a stalk. I quite like finishing with a V, so if you want to finish on a V, you would just stitch your last V shape, and then instead of putting a stalk, you would just put a little anchor stitch, and we do that by just hopping over the loop and pulling through to hold that V, and I think that's a really nice way to finish, but you've got the option. Now, closely linked to fly stitch is my favourite stitch of all time, and that is feather stitch. And you can see I've drawn in 4 lines here, so this is going to help us keep our stitches nice and even. And this is a stitch that is formed in a very similar way to fly stitch, but this time we're not going to put those vertical stalks in. We're just going to take one V into the next. So this stitch kind of rocks backwards and forwards. It's great for botanicals, for leaves and plants. It is great for feathers, obviously from the name. You can use it for fish scales. It's a really versatile and really decorative stitch. So we're going to start in exactly the same way as we started fly stitch. We're going to come up at the top of our left hand line and pull through, and then we're going to hop over to our third line. So if we think of this as line A, B, C and D, we're not going to worry about the right hand line at the moment. We're going to come up on line A and we're going to skip line B, come down on line C. Pretend line D is not there for the time being. Then we're going to find our centre line, come down a little way and come back up and catch that loop just like we did with fly stitch. So the loop gets caught on the working thread and there's our little V. Now with fly stitch we put in a little vertical stalk. We're not going to do that this time, we're going to make another V. So this time we're going to hop right across to line D. So we're starting on line B this time, hop across and go down on line D, directly across from where our thread's coming through the fabric. And then we're going to come back up again on line C, a little way down from those entry points of the thread, pull through, and then we've got another V that's looped into the first one. So now we're going to hop back to line A, so we're going to go right back to the start, back over to line A, and then we're going to come up in between on line B and pull through. So we're going to rock backwards and forwards like this. So now we're on line B, we're going to hop across to line D, come up inside that loop on line C a little way down and pull through. Now you can, if you want to, keep going down to the right for a few more stitches and then come back to the left. So you could do 3 down to the right if you wanted to, and then rock backwards. You can go totally random on this if you want to. There's no rule that says you've got to go left, right, left, right, left, right. So you can do a very regular version, or you can go much more sort of free and haphazard if you want to. I'm just going to work 2 columns of stitches here, so we're going to go back to line A, come up on line B and pull through, and then hop across line D, come up on line C and pull through, and we're just going to carry on like that all the way down to the bottom of our line of stitches. So I'm down at the bottom of my line of stitches now, and to finish off we're going to do exactly what we did at the bottom of our fly stitch. So we could, if we wanted to, put a little stalk. You can either come down vertically and make a stalk, or you could make one off diagonally. I'm just going to hop over the loop of that last V-stitch and put an anchor in place to hold that down. So similar principles to fly stitch, but much more open and organic looking. So that's feather stitch. Okay, I've got another 4 lines, and we're going to do something very similar to feather stitch, but we're going to add in another couple of steps. So this stitch is called feathered chain stitch, and this is kind of a combination of chain stitch and feather stitch. We're going to start over on the right hand side this time. It doesn't really matter what side you start on, but we're going to come up on line D. We're going to loop our thread around, and we're going to go back in at the same point where our thread came out, and pull through to make a little loop. So this is essentially the beginning of a chain stitch. Now we want to come diagonally down and come up on line C inside that loop. So we're making a little diagonal chain stitch. Now when we pull through, we're going to create a sort of teardrop shape, and that's a chain stitch essentially. Now I like to lay my thread to get the angle right, but we're going to carry on that diagonal line down and take our needle back down on line B. So we're making a chain stitch with a little stalk on it. That's our chain, and then we've got a little tail on it down to line B, and it's all following the same diagonal line. Now we want to find the bottom of that chain stitch and take that line across all the way over to the left hand side, and that's where we're going to start our next stitch. So I'm bringing my needle through on line A. I'm going to take it back down at the same point and pull through to make my little loop. And this time I'm going to bring my needle up on line B at the bottom of that stalk on the first stitch and inside the loop. So I'm pulling through, and that will make a new chain stitch that ends at the bottom of that first stitch, and I'm laying my thread down again following the diagonal, and I'm going to take my needle back down on line C. So that's our second chain stitch with a tail, and hopefully already you can see how this is similar to feather stitch in the way that it looks. So I'm finding the bottom of that second chain stitch, going right the way across to line D and making a new chain stitch. So come up on line D, down where the thread came out at the same point, and that makes my little chain. I'm going to come up on line C inside that loop and pull through, and then I lay my thread, carry the line down and go back down on line B. And so what we're getting here is a set of chain stitches that are kind of locked together, a little bit like the way feather stitch works. So straight across to line A again, make my little chain stitch come down diagonally onto line B to the end of that last little tail and pull through, follow the diagonal down and go back down on line C. Then I'm going to come up on line D, make my little chain stitch, so back down in the same place, make my loop, come up inside the loop at the bottom of the previous tail and pull through, lay my thread to follow the line down to line B, and we're just going to continue in that way all the way down to the bottom of our line of stitch. So the key is to try and line up the beginning of each chain stitch with the bottom of the previous chain stitch, and that way your stitches are going to look really regular and even and are going to sort of follow a pattern rather than looking haphazard and untidy. I'm stitching this really quite large so that you can see the pattern easily. I will show you a version of this that's stitched very small with a single strand of stranded cotton, and hopefully you'll be able to see how delicate this stitch is. It looks quite chunky here, but you can do this in a really delicate and elegant way. And again, I can either finish on a stalk, so I can take my thread through and finish there if I wanted to. Makes it look a little bit like a vine and it would look like it was grown out of the ground. I quite like, because we've started with a chain, I quite like to finish with a chain. So I'm going to make my last chain stitch, bring my needle back up inside that loop, and this time instead of adding a stalk I'm just going to hop over the loop of that chain and put a little anchor stitch in place, and that's how to finish it with a chain rather than a stalk. So that's feathered chain stitch. So here's a version where I've stitched lines of this quite close together, really tiny, so this is quite a dainty version of this stitch, and this is stitched using a single strand of a variegated thread, and you can see it looks really pretty. You can use it as a fill stitch really easily, but it's quite elegant and dainty if you work it very small. So our next stitch is one that is new to me. Actually, I've learnt this one very recently and it's stitched along a single line. This is called French Stitch and it's quite a simple one. It looks really effective though. So we're going to start at the top of our line and bring our needle through, and then I'm going to go down about 1 centimetre and take my thread back through. I don't want to pull it all the way because I want to be able to see my line, because I'm going to bring my needle back up halfway down that stitch just immediately to the right of the line, so only taking into account the thickness of the pen that I've used to mark the line, and I'm going to pull my thread through, and that's going to catch that long stitch on the thread that's coming out halfway along. I'm going to hop over that stitch, that long vertical stitch, and take my needle back down on the right hand side, and that puts a little horizontal anchor stitch in, holding my long vertical stitch out a little way to the right. So now I'm going to come up at the bottom of that stitch and go back down at the top to make a second vertical stitch. I'm going to pull through a little way, and then I'm going to bring my needle up just immediately to the left of my line, so there's a tiny gap between those two horizontal stitches. Then I'm going to hop over and pull that thread through to make another little horizontal stitch, and that's essentially French stitch. Now you could use them individually if you want to, but they look really nice stitched in a line. So I'm going to make a vertical stitch down again, come up halfway down that stitch just to the right of the line, hop over and anchor that vertical stitch in place. And now I'm going to come up at the bottom of that stitch, go back down at the top on my line, then come up halfway down that stitch to just immediately to the left of the line, hop over and anchor that stitch in place. So we're creating a sort of oval stitch with little horizontal markings halfway down, and it just looks so elegant. I think it's a great one. And you could carry on going all the way down. You can stitch these much more close together or wider apart, so let's do one that's really closely stitched. So starting at the top of the stitch, I'm going to make my vertical stitch, and this time I'm going to come up on the line itself and then put your little anchor stitch, come up at the bottom of the stitch, go down at the top and come up through the same hole that you started that horizontal stitch at, hop over and take your needle down just to the left of that thread. So you can make them quite closed if you want to. I don't think I like that as much, but it is a variation that you could make. You could also make these quite open, so let's do one where we're pulling the stitch quite open. So this time I'm coming up a little way to the right, hopping over my vertical stitch, then I come up at the bottom of the stitch, down at the top, come up a little way to the left of my line, halfway down that vertical stitch, and put a little anchor in place. So it looks really quite different depending on how you stitch it. So this is standard, then we've got a very closely spaced version, and then a very open version where it's very round and you can actually see the fabric really clearly through it. I think my favourite is the standard version, but you can play around with this a fair bit. Now this can also be used as a fill stitch, and you can make lines of these French stitches together but offset, so the roundness of the stitch sits in the gap. So this time I'm starting my stitch at the halfway point of the first line of stitches. I'm stitching a line now just over to the right of that initial line of stitches. I've started at the halfway point, so the little anchor stitches. I'm making my stitch to the right, and then I'm going to come back up at the bottom of the stitch, down at the halfway point on the first line, and put in my second anchor stitch over to the right. And that means that my new line of stitches are tucked right in to the first line, and they kind of interlock together. Let me do another one so that you can see that a little bit better. So top of the stitch that matches the halfway point of the previous line of stitches, up halfway down and a little anchor stitch to the right. Then I'm going to come up at the bottom of the stitch, go back down at the top, come up halfway along and put my little anchor stitch to the left. And you can see there how the lines of stitches are just nestling into each other. I think that would make a really pretty fill of a space. This stitch is usually worked on canvas or counted fabric, and so it works really well if you've got a very even mesh in your fabric. So that's French stitch. So all our stitches so far have been linear stitches. I'm going to show you another fill stitch. So French stitch can be used to fill. I'm going to show you another fill stitch that can be used for various shapes, and this one is called Fishbone Stitch. So I've drawn a bit of a leaf shape here and I've put a line down the centre. I find the centre line really helpful. Very simple shape. Leaf shapes work particularly well, but you could do this with pretty much any shape you wanted to. Works especially well with symmetrical shapes. So I'm going to start off by coming up at the very top point of my leaf shape, and I'm going to pull my thread all the way through, and my first stitch is going to be a vertical stitch down that centre line. So I'm going back down a little way down. And now I'm going to bring my needle back up on the left hand edge of my shape, just a tiny way down from the start of that first stitch. So I've come maybe a millimetre down the shape, and I want to make a diagonal stitch that crosses over that centre point. So I'm going to take my needle back down just to the right of that first vertical stitch and pull through. And now I'm going to echo that in the opposite direction. So I'm going to come up just down from the top on the right hand outline of my shape, and I'm going to cross over to the left and take my needle back down there. So essentially I've made an elongated cross stitch, so very long and narrow, that crosses over that centre line. So now I go back to the left, come a tiny way down again on my outline, and make a diagonal stitch across to the right. Take my needle back down, and then I'm going to come up on the outline on the right, just a tiny way down from the previous stitch, cross over to the left and take my needle back down. And if you keep your angles consistent, so if you use the previous stitches as a guide for starting your next stitch, your stitches should sit really neatly close together and create a beautiful fill. The key is to keep your stitches starting left and right at the same point. So I'm trying to get my stitches to match horizontally. What tends to happen if you don't is that you will favour one side. So I favour the left, and what happens gradually is that I move down the left hand side more quickly than I do the right, and so I end up with my stitches starting much further down on the left hand side than they are on the right. So you just want to try and make sure you're starting horizontally across from your previous stitch to make sure that these stitches are working in pairs. So I'm already drifting on the left. My left stitches are further down than the right stitches, so I'm going to compensate, and I'm going to just stitch my left hand stitches a little bit closer together on the outline than my right hand stitches, just for a couple of stitches, and that's going to bring them back into line. So I've left a little bit more space on the right hand side there than I have on the left. I'm going to do that again, so that left stitch started really close to the previous stitch, and I'm leaving a little bit more space over on the right, and within a couple of stitches those starting points will have evened up so that I'm working down the two sides of the leaf at the same rate. So another thing that can happen is that your centre line can drift. So if you haven't got a centre line drawn in, what can happen is that the crossing point can drift over to the left and you end up with the centre of your leaf finishing over on the left hand side, part way up from the bottom of the leaf. So whatever shape you're stitching, I do really recommend sketching in the central line, and it actually doesn't have to be centre. You could have an off-centre crossing point, but you just need to make sure that you know what that crossing point is. So I find that sketch line really helpful. So you can see that there are some little gaps between the stitches here, and that is because I'm using a twisted thread rather than a stranded thread. Now if you want a more complete fill so that it looks more like satin, I recommend using a stranded thread. 2 or 3 strands would do it, and if they aren't looking quite right, if you lay the side of your needle across the stitch and just rub backwards and forwards, it's called burnishing, it will help the strands of cotton to lie next to each other really neatly, and you'll get a much more sort of dense complete fill. So I'm just putting in the last few stitches here, and you should use your judgment. We just want to follow the outline really, so I'm just putting in the last couple of stitches, and as soon as you can't see your outline anymore, so here mine's blue, it's really easy to see, you can just stop stitching. You don't have to do anything different at the bottom. The stitches will just cover over each other and you get a really lovely sort of textured diagonal stitch fill. And if you really want to, you could add a straight stitch on the bottom to give your leaf a bit of a stalk. So that is Fishbone Stitch. Lovely stitch for leaves, but lots of other applications as well. Okay, our last 2 stitches are both knots, and the first one I'm going to show you is probably the one that you've been waiting for me to demonstrate, and that is a French knot. Now I know that lots of people have all manner of problems with French knots. I promise you French knots are achievable by everybody, and often it's 1 or 2 steps that are missing. So hopefully I can show you how to get a foolproof perfect French knot every time. We're going to bring our thread through and we're going to hold it towards us vertically, and we're going to keep it under tension, so it's got to look like a straight line, and then I'm going to line my needle across that thread horizontally, so I'm forming a cross with my thread and needle, and then I'm going to take my thread and I'm going to wrap it over the top of my needle. I'm going to do 3 wraps, and you know if you've got it right because you should be able to slide your needle up and down and have the wraps travel with it. They should just roll along the needle like that. Now if you have it too tight, you won't be able to move the needle at all, and if you have it too loose, you're going to end up with twists in the thread as you move it. So if you struggle with French knots, can I recommend practicing this step just to make sure that your tension is as it should be. So you should be able to slide your needle up and down like that without any trouble at all. The thread shouldn't distort and you should have free movement. Now I like to just pop my finger on those wraps to hold them steady while I do the next stage. I'm going to take the point of my needle and I'm going to go back down through the fabric a tiny distance away from where the thread came up. Now if you go back down the same hole, you're just going to pull your knot through to the back. You just need to catch a couple of fibres of fabric to keep your knot on the surface. So I've just caught one warp thread on the fabric there. You can do a little bit more if you want to. And then what people forget to do is to pull on the working thread. So what you want is for the wraps that were on your needle to slide down and sit on the surface of the fabric like that. And all I've done is just pulled the working thread a little bit. Then I'm going to take my needle through, and I'm not going to let go of that working thread, so I've got it under tension, not pulling it super tight, but I'm holding it so that it's a straight line, and I'm going to slowly pull my thread through, and I'm holding onto that thread until the very last minute, and at the last moment I let it go, and what I'm left with is a perfect tight circular French knot that's sitting on the surface of my fabric. So it's beautifully round, beautifully neat, there's no loopiness at all. So let me show you that again. Bring my thread through, hold it towards myself under tension, sit my needle horizontally on top. I'm going to wrap over the needle 3 times, put my finger on those wraps. If you want to, you can check your tension, but put the finger on the wraps. And then I'm going to go back down the fabric, catching a little bit of fabric, so not down through the same hole. Then I'm going to pull on the working thread until the wraps sit on the surface of the fabric. Keep that working thread under tension and take the needle back through. Hold on to the working thread the whole time until the very last moment, and there's my little French knot. Now you can make French knots in different sizes. I would recommend that if you want a bigger or smaller knot, you change the thread rather than the number of wraps. So probably 3. We've started with 3. 3 is about as many as you can do without the knot turning into something else. So let me just demonstrate. Now I'm using a twisted thread, so I'm limited a little bit, but let's try it with just 1 wrap. So I'm making the knot in exactly the same way, but this time I've only wrapped once, and that makes a much smaller, more delicate knot. Let's try 2 wraps. So our knot gets a little bit bigger. So here's our 3 wrap knot that we've been doing already. So you can see they get a little bit bigger each time with each wrap, but if you go above that, you start ending up with a problem. So I'm going to wrap 6 times here. And I'm going to do all the same steps, but you'll see that there's a bit of a problem because what we've got here now is quite a mobile, unstable knot. The others are sitting really tightly on the surface of the fabric, and the reason for that is that the wraps are going around to the right, and holding them in place is a little stitch that is coming out in a different direction, and that really is the only thing that's holding those wraps in place. So the more wraps you put on, the looser and more unstable it becomes. Now sometimes you want to create a loopy knot because you want to create texture, so the other way of doing it, you can do it by adding too many wraps. The other way of doing it is to not keep it under tension. So I haven't pulled my working thread, I haven't got my wraps on the surface, and I'm not trying to keep things under tension, and what I've got now is a very loopy, quite loose knot that's very different to the knots we started with. Now this is lovely for creating little flowers, for creating texture, for creating undergrowth. Sometimes a loopy knot is just what you want, but sometimes you want it to be tight and perfect, so it's possible to do both. If you want bigger knots, I would recommend doubling up your thread, or if you're using stranded cotton, try using all 6 strands, but there are other knots that will make a bigger knot shape. So our final stitch is one of those bigger knots, and it's not a round knot, this is called a 4-legged knot, and I'm going to start by making a vertical stitch. So I've come up, gone down probably ½ centimetre away to make a vertical stitch, and now I'm going to come up on the right hand side halfway down that stitch, and I'm going to just lay my thread horizontally across the top and hold it in place with my thumb. I've looped my thread round and I'm going to slide my needle diagonally under that crossing point. So I'm going from top right to bottom left, sliding my needle underneath, and I want to make sure my needle passes over the thread of that loop, and I'm going to pull that through, and that's going to tighten up that little loop into a knot at the centre of a cross, and then I'm going to go down on the right hand side just a little distance away. So I've essentially got a cross stitch with a knot at the centre. So let me do that again, and I'll make it a bit bigger this time so that you can see a bit better. So come down about 1 centimetre this time to make my vertical stitch. Coming up again, halfway down and over to the right, and I'm laying my thread, looping it back round underneath, and then I slide my needle underneath that crossing point diagonally from top right to bottom left, making sure it passes over the loop of thread that I'm holding in place there. Pull through until the knot tightens. If it tightens too quickly, it will be loose on the surface, but you can just manoeuvre it and tighten it up a little bit more. And then I take my needle back down over to the left of that cross, and that's my four-legged knot. So I think they look a little bit like stars. They'd be a really nice addition if you were doing a night sky or something like that. So let me show you again. So a vertical stitch up, again over on the right, halfway down, lay the thread, loop it back underneath, and slide the needle diagonally down from top right to bottom left, making sure your needle passes over the loop. Pull until the loop tightens at the centre, and then we're going to take our needle back down over on the left hand side to make our little cross. That's our four-legged knot. So a new knot for me, really versatile. I think it's really cute, and I think I can think of 101 ways to make use of this stitch. So that's our selection of F stitches. We've done Fern Stitch, Fly Stitch, Feather Stitch, Feathered Chain Stitch, French Stitch, Fishbone Stitch, French knots, and a four-legged knot. That's our little collection of stitches. I hope you've enjoyed that little tour. If you have, don't forget to hit the like button, and I really can't wait to see what you do with your F-stitch pages if you're stitching along with this project. If you are, don't forget to share your creations. Use hashtag FeatherStitchHouse A to Z, and that way you can see everyone's version of the F page. And don't forget to tag me at Feather Stitch House, and that way I'm guaranteed to see what you've created. I'm really enjoying seeing your stitch alphabet pages. Thanks so much for watching. Have great fun practicing your stitches beginning with F, and I will see you really soon in another video. Take care. Bye.